sitting below a tree with a very young baby. And the young baby is giggling and chortling, and they're enjoying playing with this child. And it's a picture of natural goodness in action that in the midst of typically Bergman, quite a bleak film in parts, there it is, human delight. Now, if you can't recognise that as good, actually, what the hell's the point of being sitting below a tree with a young baby? I should be out changing the world or carrying on a crusade of some time or fighting someone. If you can't see the point of that and the goodness of that, then there's a lot of work to be done before you begin redirecting your journey.
Lord, Sir, Professor, Stuart Sutherland,
yeah.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, John. Yes.
Thanks.
Well, welcome, Professor Swinburne. How do you understand the nature and attributes of the Christian God?
Well, I take this in two stages. Let's just talk about first God with a capital G, that is worshipped by both Christians, Muslims and Jews. He is a personal being. That's to say, he, like ourselves, has beliefs, has powers, and makes choices. He makes his choice solely in virtue of his seeing what is good to do. In consequence of his omnipotence, he doesn't have a body because he can move the stars just like that. So he's a person, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly free, always existing, and in consequence of that omnipresent, and in consequence of that perfectly good, because if he's simply influenced by the reasons for doing things, he's never irrational, and therefore always does that which there is good reason to do. For Christianity, there is more than one divine person, but the Father, in virtue of his perfect goodness, brings about the existence of the Son, and with the Son, in virtue of his perfect goodness, brings about the Spirit. But that doesn't, and they act together in their work, in their knowledge, in their choices. Why does God do this? Well, because God is love, and therefore perfect love must share, and therefore he doesn't do this voluntarily, he does this necessarily. But this means that the God of the Christians is really a composite of three, but it's a composite which follows from the goodness of the Father.
If God is a God of love, a Trinitarian God, why did God have to create the world? Or why did God create the world? Wasn't God sufficient within God's self?
The normal Christian view is that he certainly did not have to create the world. It was a voluntary act of choice. Why did he do it? Well, there is a certain kind of goodness which the Trinity does not possess, and that is the goodness of choosing between good and evil. God cannot do evil. Trinity cannot do evil. It's a marvelous thing for anyone to have a choice of doing good or doing evil. It's a terrible responsibility, but it's a kind of goodness which God does not possess, and therefore God might wish to create beings in virtue of his overflowing goodness who had this sort of goodness. And there are other sorts of not as good as this goodness, but other sorts of goodness which God doesn't possess, the good kinds of goodness that animals possess, or the kinds of goodness that sunsets possess, and so on. These are all good things, reason why he might make them. But for his self-sufficiency, he doesn't need them, as you say. There would be something badly wrong with a sole divine person who was satisfied with himself, but therefore he needs a Trinity, but there is no end of further good which he can, if he chooses, produce.
So of the classical arguments for the existence of God, which one or ones do you find most compelling?
Well, my view, is that all of these arguments can only be regarded as probabilistic arguments, that is to say, the premises that there is a world, or there is an orderly world, and so on, increase the probability that there is a God, and therefore you have to take them together. So your question really is to me which as it were, adds most to the probability. Difficult say really, but I suppose I am most impressed by, and first, the fact that there are laws of nature. This world is an orderly world in the sense that it's governed by very simple, comprehensible by us, laws of nature.
To that extent, do you accept the anthropic principle?
It comes into account with the second argument I was going to mention. This is the fact that what I've mentioned so far is that the world has to be a regular place in order that we, by our moving our hands and legs and so on, may make predictable differences to the world, and that can only be if there are simple laws. I can only build a building if bricks will stay on top of each other. I can only bomb somebody if I know the laws of chemistry and so on. So I can't make differences unless there's a simple universe. But of course there is a further argument distinct from that. It's not merely that the world is governed by simple laws of nature, but these laws of nature are such as to throw up human bodies. And there are innumerable possible conceivable worlds in which there are simple laws of nature, but they didn't produce us, and they couldn't produce us. And the laws of this is the argument from the fine-tuning of the universe, that its initial condition was such, and the constants of the laws of nature are such that they produce human bodies. And this is the anthropic principle you were drawing attention to, that they do have this characteristic. And again, by chance, this is immensely unlikely, because the usual sort of figures thrown around are the Big Bang had to have just such and such a velocity and such a density if we were to evolve, and it had to be, as it were, a velocity within 1 part of a million of all the possible kinds. So likewise for the density, likewise for the various constants in the laws of nature. Everything has to be fine-tuned to a very, very fine accuracy. If any of these are wrong, we don't evolve. And I think that is a further very persuasive argument, because God has a reason for producing us, and chance doesn't.
So with regards to theories, for example, the creationism of the Bible is something I imagine you would reject. But if we follow the ideas of Charles Darwin, natural selection, evolution, survival of the fittest, is that not the explanation as to why we're here? Has that not challenged your views in Christianity and the existence of God, a Darwinian response?
Well,
what would yours be, Professor Swinburne?
Let's take there are a number of things wrong with that. First, I might accept Darwinism in total. And then the question is, all right, Darwin explains why we're here and so on. But what does this explanation consist in? Well, it consists in saying that once upon a time there was a primitive organic soup at the beginning of the earth, and there are certain laws about evolution, such as that organisms multiply, their children are very slightly different from parents in different directions, there's an evolutionary advantage in complexity and so on. So the question then arises as to why did things start with that soup, and why was there this sort of complexity, particular sort of laws? After all, the human world might have started with a different sort of arrangement of matter and different laws, in which case you wouldn't get evolution. So you've got to go back further. And going back further as regards the soup at the beginning of the earth means going back to the fine-tuning we were talking about earlier. And why are there the laws of nature? Well, because there are certain fundamental laws of physics. And why are there these laws of physics when there could have been innumerable others? Well, God has a reason for producing these laws of physics. It'll lead to us. Other ones wouldn't. But that's giving Darwinism absolutely everything it wants, and I think that's rather an exaggeration, because Darwinism is a theory of elimination, actually. I mean, it explains why all sorts of forms haven't survived. They were eliminated by natural selection, but it doesn't explain why the ones were thrown up for elimination or development which were thrown up. And this, at a scientific level, is going to be a matter of biochemistry, that it throws up certain variants rather than others. And in fact, there are plenty of variants it hasn't thrown up, which would have been extremely useful if they had been thrown up. I mean, Evolution never threw up an internal combustion machine of an organic kind, but just think how it would have dominated the world if it had, by eating coal and running around the place.
Are you happy that this omnipotent God uses the pain-filled process of evolution, the subhuman animal suffering, in order that human beings may evolve as a species, be made in the image of God? Are you happy that an omnipotent God has decided to use such a method?
Well, wait a moment. Animals are a good thing. Animals have their own value. Most animals enjoy a lot of things a lot of the time. And it's not just that they enjoy things, but when you move up the evolutionary scale, they do a lot of things for others. They help their offspring, they feed their mates, and so on and so on. And they've got a purpose in life to have a family and develop a species. So animals as such are a good thing. Now, of course, there is animal suffering. Some of that suffering is, of course, just to warn animals not to do things. If they put their feet in the fire, the suffering leads to a quick withdrawal.
It's beneficial.
Yes. Other of this suffering is, of course, where they prey on other animals. This means that animals have dangers, and animals can help each other out of the danger. And therefore, if the gazelle has to avoid the lion, this means that the gazelle has a purpose in life of saving its children, and saving its children in difficult circumstances, and possibly even saving its children at the expense of its own life. If, given that animal life is a good thing, what the opponent is asking is that animal life shall never have any tasks, problems, risks, dangers, and it's the richer for that. I mean, you just shut an animal in a cage and feed it twice a day. It doesn't have much of a life. But what its life consists in is doing things, and it's the richer for doing things for other animals, including its mates and children. But if it's to do really serious things, there are going to be really serious dangers. So it's a good thing. Of course, there are downsides, there always are, but it's basically a good thing, and the downsides are necessary parts of the good thing. You can't have animals doing heroic actions unless there are serious dangers and pains.
So, if we could turn perhaps now to the issue of human suffering, as it were, and no doubt you're familiar with the idea of Dostoevsky's classic novel, The Brothers Karamazov, and in there we have the well-known conversation between Ivan, representing the voice of atheism, and his brother, the novice monk, representing the voice of theism, Alyosha. And during the course of their conversation, Ivan says God should not have created this world, because in so doing it is grounded upon the suffering of innocent children. And it's this idea of innocent suffering which is so morally abhorrent to Ivan that he says no amount of eventual harmony, eschatological verification, heaven will justify this innocent suffering. Now that's a powerful form of atheism, because God is being rejected on moral grounds.
Yes.
Ivan recognises that God exists but rejects him on moral grounds. He returns his ticket to God and says, I don't want to be part of your eventual harmony because of the method in which it occurs. Professor Swinburne, if we were to give you a ticket and you were to be Ivan, would you return it to God on moral grounds?
No, I think I would keep it. And I'll put it up there. I think each bit of suffering is necessary for some sort of good. I think God would only be justified in allowing us to suffer if four conditions are satisfied. One is that the suffering, or rather, he's justified in allowing us to suffer, putting it outside his own power, whether we suffer or not, so long as, one, that suffering, or allowing the occurrence of that suffering, is necessary for a good. Logically necessary, because God can do anything that's logically possible, so it has to be logically necessary for good. Second is that the good occurs, God actually brings about the good. Third condition is that God has the right to bring about the good. And the fourth condition is the good shall be quite great enough to outweigh the evil. Now, I believe that to be the case for all the bad states, the evils that God allows.